The past few months have been a whirlwind for anyone following the ongoing debate around federal firearms regulation. Earlier this summer, after years of advocacy, letter-writing campaigns, and late-night calls to congressional offices, the long-anticipated big bill finally passed. For many people, that moment felt like the start of a new chapter, a hard-earned reward after persistent grassroots pressure. Supporters of the Hearing Protection Act and the Short Act had invested time, energy, and political capital into a vision of meaningful deregulation under the National Firearms Act, a vision that went far beyond just changing the numbers on a tax form. But when the legislative dust settled, the outcome was far narrower than those initial dreams. The NFA's most notorious feature, the $200 transfer and making tax, was indeed reduced to zero for silencers, short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, and certain other regulated items. This was no small shift. That fee had been in place since the NFA's inception in 1934, when $200 was meant to be a prohibitive sum, equivalent to thousands of dollars today. Reducing it to nothing was a historic step. Yet, the rest of the regulatory framework, the background checks, the registration requirements, the fingerprinting, the national registry, remained untouched. But for many, that was the sticking point. Supporters of full deregulation wanted to see NFA-listed items treated like other commonly owned firearms, free from a bureaucratic process that can take months to navigate. On the other side, opponents of the bill were equally dissatisfied, but for very different reasons. They saw the elimination of the tax as a dangerous loosening of control, fearing it would open the door to more aggressive rollbacks. In the end, both camps walked away feeling as though they had lost more than they had gained. The risk, as some commentators pointed out in July, was that a $0 tax is only as secure as the political climate that sustains it. If a future Congress or administration decided to reverse course, the infrastructure for collecting that tax, the registry, the transfer process, the enforcement mechanisms, was still intact. It would take only a simple legislative amendment to reimpose a fee, perhaps one adjusted for decades of inflation. The worry wasn't abstract. American politics has a long history of policy pendulum swings, where what one session of Congress takes away, another puts back. That concern now looms even larger because of the broader political calendar. The 2026 midterm elections are just over a year away, and whichever party gains control of the House and Senate will be in a position to set the tone for the second half of the decade. The stakes are high. If the current balance shifts, the priorities on firearms policy could change dramatically. Even without waiting for a presidential transition in 2029, a new congressional majority in 2026 could push through appropriations riders or standalone bills that revisit the NFA tax question. In that context, the events of the summer of 2025 feel less like a victory lap and more like the opening round in a longer fight. For those who celebrated the $0 tax as an endpoint, it's an unsettling reminder that legislation is rarely final. For those who oppose the change, it's a chance to regroup and plan for the next opportunity to restore what they see as essential safeguards. And for the millions of Americans caught in the middle, it's one more example of how quickly the rules can change in Washington, and how important it is to pay attention, not just when a bill is signed, but in the months and years after, when the real consequences begin to take shape. While the ink was still drying on the big bill earlier this summer, political observers began scanning Capitol Hill for signs of what might come next. It didn't take long for those signs to appear. In June 2025, the House introduced H.R. 3944, officially titled the Military Construction, Veterans Affairs, and Related Agencies Appropriations Act for fiscal year 2026. On paper, the bill's purpose is routine. It sets the spending levels for military and veterans programs for the fiscal year beginning October 1, 2025. These appropriations bills move through Congress every year and, in many cases, pass without major controversy. What caught attention this time wasn't the bill's core funding provisions, but the speculation swirling around it. Some voices in the firearms community claimed that certain lawmakers could use the appropriations process as a vehicle to reintroduce the NFA tax, possibly even at a rate adjusted for inflation. The number that circulated in online discussions and in some politically charged commentary was $4,709 per transfer or making of an NFA-regulated item. That figure is derived by taking the original $200 tax set in 1934 and indexing it to decades of inflation, a calculation that does indeed produce a number in the mid-$4,000 range. However, as of mid-August 2025, the public text of H.R. 3944 contains no such provision. It is a spending bill, not a firearms law, and there is no language in its current form that imposes or adjusts the NFA tax. This fact matters, because while it's possible to amend appropriations bills with policy riders, those amendments would have to be introduced, debated, and passed through both chambers before becoming law. The absence of such a provision today does not mean it could not appear tomorrow, but it does mean that, right now, the $4,709 figure is more a warning of what could be proposed than a reflection of an active legislative change. This is where the political landscape matters. The next opportunity for a significant shift in congressional priorities comes with the 2026 midterms. If one party gains control of both the House and Senate, and especially if they hold the presidency after 2028, they could pursue changes to the NFA tax through standalone legislation or through riders on must-pass bills like the annual appropriations. This isn't speculation for speculation's sake. History is full of examples where a change to firearms law came not through a headline-grabbing reform bill, but through a few lines of text buried deep inside a larger legislative package. The idea of adjusted for inflation taxes isn't unique to firearms policy. In other areas, environmental regulation, public lands use, even postal rates, Congress has periodically updated fees to reflect the changing value of money. Supporters argue this keeps revenue streams stable over time. Opponents counter that it can dramatically increase costs for citizens without the political scrutiny that comes with creating a new tax. Applied to the NFA, an inflation adjustment would take what was already considered a prohibitive fee in 1934 and make it nearly impossible for most Americans to afford today. Even without a concrete bill proposing such a change, the conversation itself has strategic value for policymakers. By floating high figures like $4,709 in speeches or interviews, lawmakers can test the public reaction, gauge support within their party, and prepare the ground for future proposals. This is the legislative equivalent of moving pieces into position on a chessboard, not an immediate checkmate, but a setup for a decisive move later. For those paying attention, the lesson is clear: the elimination of the NFA tax this summer was a milestone, but not a guarantee. The same political system that brought the fee down to zero can raise it again, and potentially much higher. If the votes line up, watching not just the bills that pass, but the bills that are floated is essential for understanding where the policy winds might blow next. Looking ahead, it's worth remembering that federal firearms policy has never been static. The National Firearms Act itself is a product of shifting political tides, enacted in 1934 in response to violent crime during the Prohibition era. It set a high tax and stringent requirements aimed at curbing access to certain categories of weapons. Over the decades, the scope and enforcement of the NFA have been shaped not just by landmark legislation, but also by smaller, less visible changes: administrative rulings, appropriations riders, and amendments buried in unrelated bills. History offers plenty of examples where a hard-won policy shift was later reversed. The federal assault weapons ban of 1994 expired in 2004 after a sunset provision, but calls to reinstate it have resurfaced multiple times since. In other areas of law, temporary fee reductions for things like federal land use permits or certain import tariffs have been rolled back when fiscal or political priorities changed. The pattern is clear: a victory can be lasting, but only if the political will to defend it remains strong. That's why the current $0 NFA tax should be seen not as the end of the story, but as the start of a new chapter. Right now, the structure for collecting the tax, complete with background checks, fingerprints, and registration, is still in place. If the political majority shifts, all it would take is changing a single number in federal law to bring the tax back, potentially higher than ever before. The conversation around an inflation-adjusted figure in the $4,700 range isn't just about revenue, it's about access. At that level, the cost would price out nearly all but the wealthiest Americans from owning certain NFA-regulated items, effectively creating a ban without ever passing one outright. The risk is compounded by the political calendar. Between now and the end of 2026, Congress will pass at least 2 more rounds of appropriations bills. These are must-pass pieces of legislation, and that makes them attractive vehicles for adding policy changes that might not survive as standalone bills. Any amendment that affects the NFA tax, even one slipped in at the committee stage, could become law if it stays attached through the final vote, and because appropriations debates often center on funding levels and fiscal priorities. A small tax provision might not get the national attention it deserves until it's too late. For those who care about maintaining the current tax level, the most important step is awareness. This means reading not just headlines, but the fine print of legislation. It means paying attention to what lawmakers say in hearings and interviews, especially when they float trial balloons in the form of hypothetical rates or what-if scenarios. Public reaction now can influence whether a proposal gains momentum or is quietly shelved. It's also important to recognize that the conversation is happening in multiple arenas at once: Capitol Hill, state legislatures, courts, and even the executive branch through regulatory agencies. Each of these has the power to affect how the NFA is enforced and what it costs to comply with it. A court case challenging the constitutionality of the tax could be decided in the coming years, altering the playing field entirely. Conversely, a change in regulatory interpretation could make compliance easier or harder without a single vote in Congress. So, as we mark mid-August 2025, the takeaway is straightforward. The changes made earlier this summer are real, significant, and worth noting, but they are not immune to reversal. Those who want to see them preserved must remain engaged, informed, and vocal. Thank you for taking the time to watch and listen. If you found this information valuable, share it with others who care about staying informed on these issues. Staying engaged is the best way to ensure that when the next debate over the NFA tax arrives, and it will, you're ready to recognize it, understand it, and make your voice heard.